I still remember the sound the key made, grating, reluctant, as I turned it in the rusted lock of my grandfather's old cabin in Whispering Pines. That moment was a storm of emotions. Excitement clashed with a creeping sense of dread. Before I even stepped inside, the past hit me like a gust of wind. The porch still held that faded rocking chair, its wooden arms worn smooth by Grandpa Walter's hands. The peeling paint on the doorframe whispered of summers long gone, of scraped knees, lemonade, and fireflies. I told myself I'd come back to honor him, to breathe life into his memory. But truthfully, I needed an escape. Life had turned into a relentless sprint, endless deadlines, missed calls, and a version of myself I barely recognized anymore. The trees surrounding the cabin swayed like they knew I was back, pine needles hissing like old friends sharing secrets. But not all secrets are comforting. Some dig their roots into soil better left undisturbed. My name is Alex, and at the time, I couldn't have imagined that stepping across that dusty threshold would drop me straight into a storm, a war for land, legacy, and power. And at the center of that storm stood Karen Wilkinson. At first, she wore the mask well, warm smile, a tray of cookies, even a neighborly compliment about how quaint the cabin was. But beneath the surface, her eyes were already calculating. My return had disrupted something important to her. And Karen didn't like disruptions. I thought I was here to grieve, to restore. But I was walking into a battlefield disguised as a neighborhood. Soon, it became clear I wasn't just inheriting a cabin, I was inheriting a problem. One that required more than nostalgia and elbow grease. I needed legal protection. And fast. That's when I reached out to Jake Thompson, an old friend from college who'd become a sharp, no-nonsense environmental attorney. Lucky for me, he'd recently set up shop in the next county. When he pulled up one crisp morning in a beat-up pickup and stepped out with a worn leather briefcase, I could see it in his eyes. He sensed something big. Together, we pored over every line of an old, largely forgotten conservation accord, the Whispering Pines Preservation Contract. And what we found, it changed everything. Buried in the legalese were clauses strictly prohibiting any commercial construction on protected land, including, quite possibly, the very area Karen's HOA was planning to revitalize. If the document held up, it could slam the brakes on the HOA's expansion dreams. Maybe even shut them down completely. Jake was cautious. He wanted to verify the contract's legal standing with the county clerk and advised me to keep everything quiet, at least for now. He also suggested I find someone who might remember the details firsthand, someone from the old guard. And just like that, I remembered Eleanor Fisher, Grandpa's longtime friend, a recluse who still lived out by the far lake. They said she remembered everything, names, deals, even the whispers behind closed doors. But before we could celebrate our potential silver bullet, a sharp knock split the air. And then her voice.
Karen.
She stood on my porch, clipboard in hand, with a forced smile and a stack of HOA inspection forms. Her tone was syrupy, but her eyes were ice. She claimed the property required an urgent safety evaluation, per HOA guidelines, of course. As she strutted through the cabin, her heels clicked with purpose. She inspected every inch like she was appraising damage for demolition, not preservation. She made notes on the exposed beams, the outdated wiring, even the squeaky floorboards, each scribble another nail in the coffin she was quietly building for me. This all needs to be addressed, she said sweetly, before we can approve any further occupancy. I tried to explain. I mentioned the historical value of the cabin. I hinted at the conservation contract. But she waved it off with the kind of patronizing smile that tells you she's already made up her mind. As Jake and I watched her disappear down the gravel path, we both knew we weren't dealing with a neighbor. We were up against a strategist. And she wasn't planning to lose. The moment Karen stepped off my porch, her heels clicking down the steps like a judge's gavel, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. Her inspection had felt less like protocol and more like a veiled threat. Each note she scribbled down, each glance at my sagging roof beams, carried the weight of a warning. And then she said it. If these safety concerns aren't addressed immediately, We may have no choice but to deem the property uninhabitable." Her tone remained cordial, but the implication was razor-sharp. I wasn't just being hassled. I was being cornered. As the door shut behind her, I stood still, heart pounding, staring at the worn floorboards beneath my feet. This place, this cabin, wasn't just lumber and stone. It was my grandfather's legacy. And now it was under siege. That night, I couldn't sleep. The creaks of the old house felt different, heavier, like the structure itself understood the threat looming outside. I had to act, and I had to act fast. The next morning, I drove out to see Eleanor Fisher, Grandpa Walter's lifelong friend. If anyone still held the truth, it was her. She welcomed me with a warm smile, her kitchen filled with the scent of cinnamon and old wood. We sat beneath faded photographs and porcelain teacups, time-worn memories that lined the walls like protective spirits. When I brought up the conservation accord, and more importantly the Wilkinsons, her expression changed. Her smile faltered. "They were once the biggest champions of the land," she said, voice quiet. "Karen's father helped draft the very document that protected this lake." I blinked. "Wait, her father?" Eleanor nodded, sadness clouding her eyes. "But somewhere along the way, promises were sold. Money talked louder than oaths. Your grandfather tried to stop them when they started dealing behind closed doors, but he was outnumbered, outmaneuvered. Do you know anything about the penalty clause?" I asked, leaning in. She hesitated. "I remember your grandfather was adamant about including it. A safeguard. But people said some pages disappeared. Quietly. Conveniently. Especially from the copies the HOA kept. So there was more to it." As I left her house, the wind rustled through the trees like whispers from the past. I could feel something shifting. The stakes weren't just legal, they were personal. Back at the cabin, Jake and I spread the conservation accord across the table, scrutinizing every faded line. That's when we noticed it, a scribbled note in the margin, barely legible, in Grandpa Walter's handwriting. "Locker number 17. Westridge Storage. Key docs for when they try to bury the truth." Our eyes met. Neither of us said a word. We grabbed the truck keys and left. The storage facility sat like a graveyard of forgotten lives, rusted units, cracked pavement, a silence that felt unnatural. My hands trembled slightly as I twisted the lock on Unit 17. Inside was an old trunk, dust-covered, dented, and locked with a brittle clasp. We pried it open to find a trove of aging documents, brittle with time, but still legible. Jake found it first. A folded packet of parchment, still bearing wax seals and signatures. He read aloud the title, voice low and grave. "Penalty Enforcement Clause. Whispering Pines Conservation Accord." I held my breath as he scanned it. If any signatory or their descendants violates the agreement, they forfeit all development rights for the next 100 years. My knees nearly gave out. This was it. The clause Karen didn't want anyone to remember. We drove back in silence, a sense of triumph rising in my chest. For the first time, it felt like we had a weapon sharp enough to fight back. But hope was short-lived. As we pulled into the driveway, I spotted it, an unfamiliar SUV parked down the road, idling. Jake frowned. "You know them?" I shook my head. And then I saw the cabin. The front door was hanging open, splintered, lock destroyed. I ran up the steps. Inside, everything was overturned. Bookshelves emptied. Drawers pulled. And the trunk gone. My phone buzzed violently in my pocket. Unknown number. No voicemail. Again. And again. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. Someone knew what we had found. And now they were playing dirty. After the break-in, everything changed. The stolen trunk. The trashed room. My grandfather's carefully preserved documents, scattered like debris from a shipwreck. But it wasn't just a burglary. It was a message. I was playing a dangerous game. Jake was adamant. "We need to call the cops." We did. But when the officer arrived, clipboard in hand, his inspection felt more like routine theater than real investigation. He nodded at the damage, took a few notes, and left with a promise to follow up. But we both saw it. The way his gaze drifted when we mentioned Karen's name. The way he seemed to know he couldn't get involved too deeply. Karen's web stretched farther than I'd imagined. Still, I wasn't about to back down. I hid the documents in a lockbox with a hidden compartment, far from the cabin, taking no chances this time. If they were willing to break into my home, who knew what they'd try next? But something unexpected began to happen. Whispers started to circulate around the neighborhood. Neighbors I barely knew began stopping by during walks, offering quiet, cautious support. Some said they'd always felt uneasy about how much control Karen and Richard wielded. They fined people for planting the wrong kind of flowers, one elderly woman muttered, eyes darting toward the street. They made me repaint my fence twice, another whispered. They were afraid but not blind. And suddenly, I realized I wasn't just protecting my grandfather's land. I was standing up for everyone who had been silently pushed around. That night, I sat alone at the dining table with old photo albums. Pictures of the lake, the forest, and smiling families from decades ago filled the pages. My grandfather, always in the center, always smiling. His love for this place, his home, ran deeper than roots. I wouldn't let them bury his legacy. A few days later, the HOA meeting was called. The building was cramped and buzzing with tension. Fluorescent lights hummed above us, like warning sirens. Homeowners packed the folding chairs. Some looked confused. Others looked angry. All of them looked curious. Karen stood at the front, poised and polished like a politician mid-campaign. Her smile was tight, her eyes sharp. Richard hovered nearby, arms crossed, his expression unreadable but cold. When they opened the floor for comments, I stood up and walked to the microphone. My heart thudded in my chest, but I steadied my voice. I'm here to talk about the Conservation Accord and the promises this community once made. Gasps echoed when I held up the original documents, penalty clauses and all, sealed, signed, and dated. These prove that any development violating these terms is illegal, I said, projecting my voice above the murmurs. My grandfather helped draft this to protect the land from exactly what's being proposed. Karen tried to interrupt, insisting the accord was outdated. But Jake stepped forward. It's still binding under state environmental law. We've already consulted legal counsel. That silenced the room. People began shouting questions. Some demanded a vote. Others called out Karen and Richard directly. And for the first time since I'd returned to Whispering Pines, Karen looked shaken. Her smile faltered. Richard clenched his jaw, rage flashing in his eyes. But there was something else beneath it, fear. The meeting ended in chaos. No votes. No resolutions. Just confusion, shouting, and Karen storming out. I had struck a blow. A real one. But I also knew what was coming next. Karen wasn't going to retreat quietly. And sure enough, within days, the propaganda began. Brochures. Memos. Social media posts. Flyers tucked into every mailbox. Lakefront Revival Project. The future of Whispering Pines. Modern cabins. Upscale dining. A luxury spa. Renderings of perfect families on paddleboards and smiling baristas serving organic lattes by the shore. The fine print? It barely mentioned the ecological destruction, the forest loss, or the fact that it was a direct violation of the accord. Karen painted me as the villain, the paranoid heir clinging to the past and blocking progress. I became the scapegoat for everything she claimed was holding the community back. But I wasn't shaken. I saw through the glossy paper and hollow promises. And I wasn't the only one. At the bottom of Karen's glossy brochures, I noticed something troubling, a brief mention of an independent environmental assessment that claimed no major risks to the land. But I knew better. The assessment's vague language and lack of signatures didn't align with the strict protections outlined in the original accord. It was a smokescreen. Disheartened but not deterred, I began distributing counterflyers of my own, printed on recycled paper, a subtle nod to the values Grandpa would have appreciated. They outlined the penalties for violating the conservation terms and reminded neighbors of their original commitment to preserving Whispering Pines' natural beauty. I placed them in mailboxes, pinned them to notice boards, and handed them out at the local cafe. People began to look at me not as a troublemaker, but as someone willing to stand for something. Then came the threats. One night, I found a note slipped under my door, scribbled in a rushed, anonymous hand. "Drop it, or you'll regret it." A chill ran down my spine, but fear only sharpened my focus. Karen wasn't just manipulating public opinion. Rumors began circulating that she was greasing the palms of local officials. It was whispered that promises of tax revenue and a luxury spa had been enough to sway zoning officers who had previously defended environmental protections. Jake and I began compiling evidence: phone logs from harassing calls, screenshots of doctored memos, even recorded testimonials from residents who had seen HOA documents mysteriously change overnight. Despite the threats, a growing number of homeowners began quietly offering their support. They shared stories of Karen's iron grip, how she fined families for mismatched curtains, threatened to foreclose over minor landscaping violations, or used HOA fees to pay for lavish planning trips. The more they talked, the clearer it became. This was never about revitalization. It was about control. Some residents even volunteered to testify, including a retired clerk who had once handled the original environmental filings. She swore, under oath, that she had seen tampering in the registry. With Jake's help, I began building a legal case that could not be ignored. We scheduled a court hearing to present the original accord, expert testimony, and evidence of manipulation. Then Karen made her boldest move yet. I awoke one morning to the rumble of engines. Outside, just beyond the tree line near the lake, massive construction equipment had been moved in. Bulldozers, excavators, survey stakes lined the shore like a death sentence for the forest. A new sign had been posted declaring, "Future site of Whispering Pines Lakeside Retreat, preliminary clearing in progress." I ran down to the edge of the site, a cord in hand, waving it like a shield. "This is protected land," I shouted at the workers. Some looked unsure. Others just shrugged. "We're just doing our job," one said. "Talk to our boss." A foreman approached, arrogant and smirking. "We've got permits. Don't waste your time." I took pictures of everything: equipment, signs, workers. The foreman warned me to back off. Jake moved fast, filing an emergency cease and desist. But the legal system creaked along, and every hour of delay meant more trees lost. That evening, as the machines powered down, I sat on the porch in silent fury. But then something unexpected happened. One by one, neighbors began arriving at the edge of the forest, holding handmade signs, wearing raincoats, carrying lanterns and folding chairs. A spontaneous protest had begun: mothers, retirees, teenagers. One held a sign that read, "Not in our name." Another said, "Our trees are not for sale." As the sun dipped below the treetops, someone brought a thermos of coffee. Another started a campfire. There was no speech, no official leader. Just quiet, steadfast resistance. Karen thought she could divide and conquer. But that night, standing beside my neighbors in the fading light, I realized she underestimated what a community could do when it remembered what it was fighting for. Karen arrived flanked by private security personnel, their dark suits and mirrored sunglasses adding a theatrical edge to her entrance. She was clearly determined to quell the outcry, to stamp her authority onto the scene like it was just another zoning dispute she could steamroll. Tensions flared. Words were exchanged, sharp, raw, and emotionally charged. For a tense moment, I truly worried that someone might throw a punch. Karen's voice cut through the rising noise, cold and resolute. "Progress is unstoppable. You'll all regret standing in its way." I clenched my jaw. My resolve trembled, but it didn't break. The day of the court hearing came faster than I had anticipated. The courthouse loomed, a weathered limestone relic of another era, with its heavy wooden doors and echoing hallways steeped in whispered conversations. Reporters had already gathered outside, sniffing out scandal. Some painted the conflict as a quaint small-town squabble over trees and tradition. Others framed it as a modern-day David versus Goliath story, me against Karen Wilkinson, the HOA president with a property empire and a ruthless smile. Inside, The air was taut with expectation. Jake stood beside me, flipping through binders packed with records, the original accord, the redlined alterations, the forensic reports. Our arsenal was paper, but it felt like iron. Karen swept in with the poise of someone used to owning every room she entered. She wore a tailored gray suit, immaculate as always. Her husband Richard trailed behind, phone glued to his ear, undoubtedly orchestrating some last-minute maneuver. Their attorney was every bit the stereotype: slick, fast-talking, clutching thick binders like weapons, radiating unearned confidence. The proceedings began. Our strategy was simple but strong. Prove the legal validity of the original conservation accord and demonstrate how Karen's development plans directly violated it. Their defense tried to cast doubt on the documents, implying that they were incomplete or possibly forged. But then we presented the missing pages we had recovered from Grandpa's storage locker, bearing original signatures and embossed seals from community notaries and founding residents. The courtroom murmured with renewed interest. The judge leaned forward. Something had shifted. Jake called in a forensic specialist who testified that the pages were consistent with the paper and ink used at the time and showed no signs of tampering. Our case grew stronger. Karen, to her credit, never flinched. She sat expressionless, fingers laced together, confident her legal team would dismantle us in time. But she hadn't counted on one devastating detail. In a final rebuttal, Jake held up the authenticated copy and pointed to a familiar name. Margaret E. Wilkinson, Karen's grandmother, and one of the original signatories of the accord. The irony was undeniable. Karen, in attempting to erase the accord, was erasing her own legacy. The judge raised an eyebrow. Her lawyer stammered. Karen's calm demeanor cracked for the first time, just slightly. When the session adjourned for the day, I felt a strange blend of exhaustion and cautious hope. We had delivered a serious blow. But I knew Karen wasn't finished yet, and the final ruling would decide everything. Days passed in a blur. The town held its breath. During that time, I found moments of peace by the lake, walking its quiet shores at dusk. The golden light rippling on the water reminded me of simpler times: family barbecues, morning canoe trips with Grandpa, the feel of pine needles under bare feet. The land wasn't just scenery. It was memory. I spent time restoring the cabin, tightening door hinges, patching small cracks in the wood, wiping dust from photo frames. Every dent, every scratch held a story. Every board felt like part of a family heirloom. Then one evening, Amanda Peterson knocked on my door. She was a distant cousin, someone I hadn't seen in years. Word of the battle had reached her, and she came bearing support and a thick folder of old letters she'd found in her attic. Letters Grandpa had written to environmental groups across the state, passionately advocating for the lake's protection. They weren't legally binding, but they spoke volumes about his values. Each letter layered our case with emotional truth, painting a portrait of a man who had seen this threat coming long before it arrived. Amanda and I spent hours reading through them, laughing over Grandpa's stubborn phrasing, pausing over phrases that now felt prophetic. She shared her belief that the community needed a gathering place, somewhere to reconnect outside the reach of Karen's authoritarian HOA. A place for neighbors to meet freely, for kids to learn about the land around them. The idea planted a seed in me. What if we reclaimed the HOA's meeting hall, turned it into a community center? Not just a space, but a symbol, a tribute to what we were fighting for. That night, I fell asleep with a fire in my chest. The next morning, as the final court date dawned, I stood in the hallway outside the courtroom not as someone merely defending the past, but as someone ready to build a future. As I stood in the courtroom hallway, I spotted Karen huddled in urgent conversation with her attorney. Their faces were tight, stress lines deepening with every whispered exchange. Richard paced nearby, glancing out the window as if expecting reinforcements. In that flicker of panic in his eyes, I saw the cracks forming in their once unshakable facade. It made me wonder, was their entire empire of half-truths and intimidation finally beginning to crumble? The judge wasted no time. Calling the court to order, he began delivering his decision in a calm, measured voice. My heart pounded like a drum in my chest as he laid out the legal findings. The original accord was indeed valid, and the missing clauses, including the strict penalties for violations, remained firmly in force. He enumerated how the Wilkinsons' development plans directly conflicted with the Accord's conservation stipulations. Any permits issued under false pretenses were null and void. A hush fell over the gallery as the judge ordered an immediate cessation of all construction activities and warned that penalties would be pursued against anyone knowingly breaching the terms. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. A wave of relief washed over me. The lakefront improvement project was dead on arrival. What followed was a whirlwind. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing to capture every quote from anyone willing to speak. Jake gripped my shoulder, a silent gesture conveying both exhaustion and victory. Karen tried to maintain her composure while addressing the media, but her words faltered. She insisted she had only acted in the community's best interests, blaming administrative oversights for any discrepancies. Richard stood behind her, shell-shocked, as if the foundation of his world had collapsed beneath him. Watching them scramble to spin their narrative, I almost felt pity. Almost. But then I remembered the threats, the vandalism, the fear they had sown with impunity. I felt no sympathy for their downfall, only gratitude that the truth had finally prevailed. Stepping outside the courthouse, a group of residents greeted me with applause. Some shook my hand, thanking me for fighting a fight they hadn't known how to wage. One woman, tears in her eyes, explained that her late father had been one of the original signatories of the accord. She'd been heartbroken to watch it disregarded for so long. My heart swelled with solidarity. This victory wasn't just mine or Grandpa's. It belonged to every voice that refused to be bullied. The press clamored for statements, and though my voice shook slightly, I managed to say, "This is about protecting what matters most, our heritage, our environment, and our freedom from intimidation." In that moment, a burden lifted from my shoulders, replaced by cautious optimism. Maybe, just maybe, Whispering Pines could chart a new path, free from the shadows of corruption and greed. In the days that followed, legal repercussions rained down on Karen and Richard Wilkinson. Investigations unearthed evidence of bribery attempts, forged permits, and suspicious financial transactions linking to a broader network of manipulation. Local press, emboldened by the public's appetite for truth, dug deeper, exposing staggering sums funneled into hush funds. Neighbors came forward, courageously testifying how they had been coerced into silence through threats of fines and property code violations. Meanwhile, the HOA itself unraveled. Board members resigned en masse, unwilling to be tainted by Karen's tarnished legacy. It was as if a dam had broken, truth flooding every corner of a community that had been stifled for far too long. Caught in a whirlwind of interviews and thank-you notes, I read messages from people inspired to stand up in their own local disputes. The fight had become bigger than one small town. One evening, sitting on the cabin's porch with a cool drink in hand, I watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and amber. The pine trees rustled softly, almost as if acknowledging that justice had been served. With development halted and legal actions enforcing the conservation measures, the forest Grandpa loved could finally breathe freely again. Though Karen still tried to salvage her reputation, the court's ruling had irreversibly changed the course of Whispering Pines' future. The court's ruling was definitive. Karen's development project was canceled, and her personal liability for breaching the accord was under scrutiny. Even from my vantage point, I could see she faced substantial lawsuits that threatened to wipe out whatever fortune she had left. I had little doubt she regretted ever underestimating the power of a determined community standing on the side of law and conscience. Time has a way of softening the rough edges of conflict, but it also offers space for reflection. Over the next few weeks, I spent my mornings working with volunteers to clean up the scars left where bulldozers had torn into the earth. The gaping patches of disturbed soil were replanted with native saplings, a small but symbolic act of restoration. The sound of children laughing as they helped water the new trees was a balm to my weary spirit, reminding me that future generations deserve to inherit this land just as Grandpa had intended. At the same time, I dove into discussions with community members about transforming the old HOA building into a cultural and environmental center. Amanda Peterson and Jake Thompson threw themselves wholeheartedly into the project, each bringing unique talents. Amanda drafted a blueprint that replaced sterile conference tables with an open reading room, a small library of environmental texts, and an interactive display about local wildlife. Jake connected us with nonprofits specializing in conservation education, hoping to secure grants to fund our endeavor. Before long, we had the beginnings of a true community-driven initiative. Every time I looked at the blueprint, I felt a flutter of excitement, envisioning a place where residents could gather for workshops, lectures, and social events, without the looming fear of an authoritarian HOA. Even as the legal battles against Karen and Richard dragged on, life in Whispering Pines began to shift. The anxiety that once permeated the air was replaced by cautious optimism. For me, the cabin evolved from a familiar relic into a tangible testament of hope and renewal. Not everything was smooth sailing, of course. Karen's shadow lingered in the form of incomplete permits, battered finances, and ongoing lawsuits. A handful of her staunch supporters still viewed me as a meddler who had cost the town a golden economic opportunity. Some openly scowled when they passed by on the street, muttering under their breath that I had doomed Whispering Pines to stagnation. Their accusations stung, but I stood firm in my belief that the best progress is the kind that doesn't sacrifice the soul of a place for profit's sake. Besides, for every detractor, there seemed to be 2 or 3 supporters who offered heartfelt encouragement. Eleanor Fisher's eyes always sparkled when she visited, praising the strong stand we'd taken and marveling at how Grandpa Walter would have been proud to see his vision upheld. It felt surreal to think how far we'd come, from discovering a dusty old contract in a storage locker to spearheading a community revival. One late afternoon, as I strolled through the pines, the wind carried the gentle hum of wildlife. Birds fluttered overhead, and sunbeams pierced the canopy, illuminating a path that seemed to stretch on indefinitely. In that moment, I felt the magnitude of what had been saved. This wasn't just about land or trees, it was about preserving a tapestry of memories and forging a legacy that would outlive us all. My phone buzzed, reminding me of an upcoming meeting with county officials to finalize the protective status of the area. The fight wasn't fully over. Paperwork, administrative hurdles, and local politics remained. But the heart of the battle had been won. For the first time in ages, I felt the sweet relief of hope overcoming exhaustion. The day we officially signed the documents reaffirming the enforceable protection of the Whispering Pines Accord was almost as momentous as winning the court case itself. A small ceremony took place in front of the lake, with county representatives, environmental advocates, and community members gathered to witness the signing. The atmosphere was celebratory yet dignified, as though everyone understood they were becoming part of a legacy that transcended individual ambition. I found myself choking up as I added my signature to the updated Register of Land Conservation, effectively linking Grandpa Walter's original endeavor to this new chapter. Afterward, an impromptu picnic broke out, complete with homemade pies, grilled vegetables, and a sense of camaraderie that had been absent for far too long. In the midst of the festivities, children laughed by the water's edge, skipping stones and scaring away small fish. Meanwhile, older folks reminisced about their youth, recalling how the lake had once been a hub for fishing, swimming, and community gatherings. For a moment, the decades that separated us seemed to dissolve, leaving only a shared appreciation for the natural beauty surrounding us. Karen and Richard were nowhere in sight, presumably dealing with the fallout of their legal troubles. I did overhear someone mention that Richard had tried to relocate to another county, seeking to escape the backlash of public opinion. I felt a pang of pity, but it was quickly overshadowed by relief. I remembered the threats, the intimidation, and the way they had nearly succeeded in transforming this sacred land into a playground for the wealthy. The weight of what we had preserved settled on my shoulders, not as a burden, but as a comforting reminder that we had done the right thing. Even the pine trees, swaying gently in the breeze, seemed to sigh with contentment, as though they recognized that this victory was theirs as much as it was ours. In the following weeks, the old HOA building began its transformation. Walls were knocked down to create open, airy spaces. Volunteers armed with paintbrushes and contagious zest arrived daily to contribute to the metamorphosis. Donation drives provided shelves, books, and interactive displays. Some local artists even offered to create murals depicting the wildlife and the historical timeline of Whispering Pines. Each day, I marveled at how people from all walks of life pitched in, united by a newfound sense of ownership in their community. Amanda became the de facto project manager, orchestrating everything from the building design to the scheduling of workshops. Once the center opened, she joked that she'd never expected to become a community coordinator, but life had a knack for leading us down surprising paths. Jake, meanwhile, offered free legal advice sessions once a week, helping residents with everything from complicated mortgage questions to minor disputes that might otherwise have been mishandled by the old HOA. As for me, I couldn't step into the building without feeling a surge of pride and a twinge of disbelief. The very space Karen had once monopolized as a throne room for her authority was turning into a hub for transparency, education, and unity. Late one evening, after everyone had gone home, I stood in the center of the newly painted main hall. Light fixtures cast a gentle glow over the bright, welcoming space. A wave of gratitude washed over me, and I silently thanked Grandpa Walter for guiding me here. The process was far from finished. There were still months of work ahead, but the foundation had been laid. It was more than a renovation of a building, it was a renovation of a community's spirit. Eleanor invited me one Sunday to her modest home for a small celebration, a heartfelt gathering honoring our triumphant efforts to revitalize conservation in Whispering Pines. Though informal, the air buzzed with gratitude and unity. Neighbors filled her living room, sharing memories of falling in love with the lake and the forest trails while munching on homemade cookies. Soft music played in the background, interweaving with gentle conversations that recalled happier times and hopes for the future. Near a bookshelf lined with cherished photo albums, Eleanor, her eyes bright with pride, handed me a worn journal that had once belonged to Grandpa Walter. As I traced my fingers over the faded ink of his sketches and musings on nature's delicate balance, I was overwhelmed by the sense that he was right there with me, whispering dreams of a sustainable future. Tears of joy and humility welled in my eyes. The journal was a message from the past, affirming that we had come so far despite the struggles. Soon after, the day of Karen's indictment hearing arrived. Local news channels, hungry for the dramatic finale, showed footage of Karen stepping out of a sleek black sedan, escorted by her lawyer, once so confident in her ability. Karen's attempt to manipulate the system was no longer convincing. Her tense demeanor and darting eyes betrayed the enormity of the charges against her: fraud, conspiracy to violate environmental laws, misuse of HOA funds, among others. Watching her on screen was surreal. Just a few months ago, she had seemed invincible, her polished smile concealing ruthless ambition. Now, her empire appeared reduced to hushed corridors and damning testimonies. When her lawyer requested a brief continuance, the judge's swift approval signified that the legal noose was tightening around her. As I stared at the blank screen after the coverage ended, I realized this was not merely a personal vindication but a clear message that entrenched corruption could be rooted out by persistence and truth. In the weeks that followed, life in Whispering Pines began to shift in remarkable ways. Where ominous signs of invasive construction had once loomed, young saplings now sprouted vibrantly, thanks to a community-driven reforestation initiative. The land seemed to speak of resilience, reminding us that nature was the true protagonist of our story. My energy shifted to finalizing preparations for the community center's grand opening, a project that symbolized our collective renewal. The center, which housed exhibits on the Whispering Pines Accord, displayed photos, articles, and even a glass case preserving the original copy of the Accord, offering a tangible connection to Grandpa Walter's vision. In the day leading up to the ceremony, I caught my reflection in the cabin's mirror, a man older, wiser, and steadied by hardship, yet filled with hope. I tenderly traced a worn photograph of Grandpa and me by the lake, silently thanking him for guiding me through the darkest moments. On the morning of the grand opening, the sun cast shimmering reflections across the lake, infusing the community center's lawn with festive brilliance. Volunteers arranged folding chairs, set up a makeshift stage, and hung cheerful bunting and balloons. People trickled in, ranging from longtime residents to curious newcomers. I greeted each with a heartfelt smile, knowing that what we had built was not just a structure, but a beacon of hope and collaboration. Jake, ever vigilant, scanned the crowd for any lingering legal issues, while Amanda orchestrated the display of a large banner proclaiming Whispering Pines Community and Conservation Center Grand Opening. At the podium, my hands trembled with both nerves and excitement as I recounted the trials we had endured, carefully avoiding any gloating about Karen's downfall. I spoke of the transformation we had collectively achieved, thanking Grandpa Walter for his enduring vision. In a moment of vulnerability, I admitted that every pine needle, every shifting breeze reminded me of his timeless presence guiding our fight for justice and conservation. Amid enthusiastic applause, Amanda ceremoniously cut the ribbon. The crowd surged inside to explore interactive displays and historical exhibits that celebrated the land and its heritage. Later, as the celebration wound down, I found solace in a quiet conversation with Eleanor. Leaning on her cane, she gazed at a newly installed mural depicting the evolution of Whispering Pines, from its humble beginnings to its current revival. In rich shades of green and brown, the mural told tales of a community once oppressed by greed and now reborn through unity. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she said softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears that mirrored my own. Her words, woven with both nostalgia and hope, confirmed that everything Karen had attempted to undermine, our shared sense of unity, stewardship, and deep-rooted community memory, had found new life in our efforts. Standing there, I felt deeply that we were not merely celebrating a victory against corruption, but embracing a future defined by respect for nature and for one another. As the evening light faded, I stepped outside and watched the moon cast gentle shadows among the pine trees, feeling the quiet approval of the forest itself. In that moment, I understood that our struggles had forged an unbreakable bond, and Whispering Pines would forever stand as a testament to the enduring power of community and conservation. Over the next several days, the momentum grew. Local youth groups began planning environmental camps at the new community center, and neighbors organized a small garden on a vacant lot adjacent to the local school board even proposed field trips so students could learn about the original accord, conservation practices, and local folklore firsthand. My schedule overflowed with phone calls and emails, but the busyness energized me rather than wearing me down. Occasionally, I would catch a news update mentioning Karen Wilkinson and her ongoing court case, reminding me of the remnants of her influence. She was now rarely seen in public, instead absorbed in legal wranglings that promised serious repercussions. The media's attention had shifted away from her grand vision of resort developments to scandalous allegations of embezzlement and intimidation. Meanwhile, the ostentatious Wilkinson mansion on the hill endured heavy scrutiny, with rumors that Richard had even attempted to sell the property, only to be stymied by pending litigation. I often wondered whether Karen or Richard ever paused to reflect on the harm they had caused. Yet I refused to be distracted by their missteps. Instead, I focused on nurturing the new community spirit forming around the center. We organized a Night Under the Pines event, inviting local musicians and storytellers to perform under the stars, with the forest serving as our natural amphitheater. Families brought blankets, children's laughter filled the air, and local artisans showcased crafts inspired by the region's flora and fauna. Standing amidst the enthusiastic crowd, I felt an intangible spark of community pride. The voices that had once been silenced by fear now rang out confidently, forging a fresh identity for Whispering Pines, an identity that embraced nature, justice, and unity over exploitation and greed. In this renewed atmosphere, my cabin once again felt like a sanctuary, free of the dread of unannounced inspections or vandalism. I enjoyed simple pleasures, watching the morning mist roll over the lake from my porch, cooking hearty meals over the old stone fireplace, and gathering with friends under the soft glow of lanterns. The pine-scented air calmed my nerves in ways I hadn't experienced since my youth. Sometimes, I found myself mentally drafting letters to my late grandfather, updating him on every new development and small victory. In those moments, I realized the Accord was not simply a set of rules. It was a solemn promise to cherish and protect this land for future generations. I understood that once we let our guard down, there would always be another Karen Wilkinson lurking in the shadows, waiting to exploit the forest for profit. That realization steeled my determination to remain ever vigilant. Defending something precious is a never-ending endeavor, a lesson my grandfather clearly understood. Outside, as the moon bathed the pines in silver light, I felt the forest silently approving my mission. Sleep came quietly, filling my dreams with images of flourishing pines, carefree children, and a future free from the threat of bulldozers. Soon after, official news arrived that Karen had taken a plea deal, admitting to lesser charges in exchange for testifying about a bribery network. The revelation sent ripples through Whispering Pines, eliciting mixed reactions, a sense of relief in some quarters and outrage in others. In my quiet cabin, I experienced a bittersweet finality. One tumultuous chapter was closing. I was not naive enough to expect forgiveness from Karen, nor did I feel compelled to extend it. The essential victory was that the law had held her accountable, quashing her ability to exploit the community. On television, her once imperious image had been replaced by a subdued, almost hollow figure. The final sentencing, coming 3 weeks after the plea, included hefty fines, restitution, and a short prison term. Rumors hinted she might leave town after serving her sentence, never to return to Whispering Pines. The thought reinforced the sense of justice that had finally prevailed. After her downfall, normal life gradually returned to Whispering Pines. The community center buzzed with activity. Book clubs, photography classes, environmental seminars, and weekly potluck dinners revitalized the local spirit. Families explored new trails around the lake, while children collected pine cones for art projects. Jake even began a monthly legal clinic, advising locals on everything from estate planning to minor disputes. Amanda organized a rotating schedule of events featuring local musicians and playwrights. Soon enough, visitors came to the cabin, curious to hear the backstory of our dramatic shift. I found myself often retelling tales of my grandfather's steadfast dedication, the labyrinth of hidden documents uncovered, and our hard-won victory against entrenched power. Each retelling reminded me of how precarious our victory had seemed, yet also highlighted the strength that emerges when a community unites to protect what truly matters. The once threatened forest now thrived, its vibrant life a testament to resilience. Occasionally, I'd see deer or foxes venture close as if offering silent thanks. In those moments, I recalled my grandfather's timeless words, reinforcing that we are merely stewards of this land, entrusted with protecting its silent wonders for those who will come after.